So we've been talking about photography, and my current academic scholarly life is as a geographer and rural sociologist, but my training is actually in photography, in landscape photography. So I became interested in the rural landscape and the way that the rural landscape is important in urban life and in people's everyday lives, largely accidentally. I was taking photographs and I was putting these photographs up on my studio wall as I thought about them and was editing them. And people would come into my studio and tell me stories about what they thought those photographs meant. And they were often very emotional stories, and they were often very, what I thought at the time, they were incredibly incorrect. They didn't describe what I saw in these photographs. So I was photographing remnants of agricultural landscapes in what has become a very residential landscape in the United States Northeast. And people would come in and tell me stories about wilderness and what they saw. And one of the stories that really has always stuck with me is someone looking at a stone wall on the foundation of a house and talking about old growth forest. And so I think what happened during this time is that I became as much an ethnographer as an artist. So I spent several years in my early training going around making images. I was painting and making photographs of the landscape. And then, in addition to that, finding out what that landscape meant to people. And then that kind of drove me into some environmental history and trying to figure out, well, what had happened in these landscapes and what had happened in the culture around them, so that when people looked at what I saw as a farming landscape, they saw it as a landscape that had no people in it. And it turned out that the people who studied this kind of thing were geographers, and that geography and cultural geography as a field of study had been kind of marginalized in the United States. So I spent about 10 years outside the US studying what it is that makes people think about landscapes and environment in a particular way. And then, of course, I came back and discovered that there were lots of people studying this. They had just been in disciplines next to geography or close to geography, and that geography itself was experiencing a massive renaissance. And places that hadn't had geography departments were bringing them back as spatial analysis units or, environmental studies under different kinds of names. And it turns out that what I was doing was really popular both in the academy, but also in popular culture. So I had people calling me and saying, hey, you study why landscapes make people really upset in these different ways. Can you come and help us figure out how people using land in this way and people using land in that way can get along better? So I've ended up being a scholar who does public participatory land use research, and I use a ton of different ways to go about that. I mostly right now am studying the conflicts between urbanization and agricultural land uses, and then within agricultural land uses, different kinds of justifications for creating different kinds of agroecologies and different kinds of socio-environments. And so I have come full loop in some ways because I still use these images and kind of making pictures. I think I make a lot more diagrams now than I used to try to say, okay, you seem to think about the landscape in these ways, and these seem to be the motives for you, and you seem to talk about it in these other ways, and where's our starting place, the common ground, and what are the things where everything's going to explode, and we're going to need to do something really interesting to keep this conversation going.
Can you push it back just a little farther? I mean, we started your story with you're taking photographs. You're taking photographs of landscapes and then asking people to comment on that. Can you say a little bit about where that project came from?
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I wasn't even asking people to comment on them in the first place. I was really just making these photographs, and that was part of what struck me is that people would come in, people walking through. I had a somewhat, a studio in a fairly public place would just come in and kind of uninvited even do this how did I get into taking these photographs? So I had this camera that was, you'll like this, a turn of the century view camera, but it was a pocket. It was designed, I wish I had it. It's about the size of this notebook, a little bit thicker, and it unfolds and the bellows comes out. And it was the kind of camera that people would have used who were taking, so it's after glass plates, but where they're still using really large film holders and not enlarging the negatives. So I used a fairly historical process. I used these paper negatives, so you were just making contact prints with them. And I was using this partly because it was a cheap view camera, and also I had worked in a library. I'd worked in a library of, it was a women's history collection in the Schlesinger Library, and my job was to enter travel photographs of women who had traveled at the turn of the century and had brought back travel photographs. And my portfolio was largely Southeast Asia and these amazing photographs of incredibly densely constructed landscapes. So one of the images that's really stuck with me was bamboo fences where every piece of bamboo was tied in several places, and you could see the ties, and there was just so much labor in these landscapes, and everything you saw was so carefully made, and there were layers and layers of making. But then the environments, they were beautiful natural environments at the same time. So I suspect that I was really drawn to these combinations of landscapes that were themselves influential environments, but that also encoded all sorts of things that people had built into the environments, the way they thought things should be kind of built into that, so that those things then created further lessons for people of how to comport themselves and how to be in the world. And I wish I had kind of an origin story for this. What I find now as I look back at my notebooks and I was thinking about these questions and in seminars with people like Leo Marx kind of early on and thinking about landscape and this co-constitution of people's everyday lives and the landscapes they create through those, and then the way that those get reproduced in everyday life for more or less as long as I can remember. I grew up very transiently. My family moved around a lot, and so I suspect that maybe there's some influence on figuring out kind of what is home and what is a home place. How do people understand themselves in place? And why do I really like sandplain environments and short oak trees and striped pines and things like that? And why is that different from this other place? So that's about as far back on that as I think I can go.
Now, I've talked to people who say a lot of that sort of thing about interior design, about architects.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie Van Duzer was one of my heroes on this. And, I mean, she's trying to figure out what makes a house a home in some ways.
Right.
But you're interested in sort of exterior environments
right.
with the same spirit.
Right.
What is it that makes that feel in some way humane?
Well, and I like that space in between things, partly because it's a much more unconscious space in some ways. So people make these spaces, but I think they don't necessarily know that they make them as much. I think that they're spaces that get made, not necessarily unselfconsciously, but they're often spaces where there are uncomfortable conflicts, or at least contrasts, between the decisions that get made in a more interior design kind of way, and then the decisions that get made because people drive a lot, or because they throw trash out their windows. And then there are kind of, all those places where the ripple effects of people's activities run into each other and have to be figured out in some way. So I feel like there's a much more interesting story that can be kind of read and then fed back into governance processes from external environments. Internal environments often have all of their governance already figured out and kind of hidden away in the closet some way.
So, where have you felt most at home?
It's funny that you say that, because I I've just come on a really kind of interesting loop around the United States. I drove from, there was a food conference in Missoula, Montana, and then my husband was at a conference down in California. So we took a 4-day road trip through the western United States, and that was very grand. And you could see all sorts of fascinating things. Like the prevalence of RV ownership was amazing. People had extensions of their homes almost along that entire route. We went down through Idaho and a big loop around Utah. And almost every home we went by, there was an RV, and you felt like these people have really like extensions of their home, and they go places, but they have homes they bring with them, kind of like hermit crabs or something. And then I came back and I took a big loop down through Iowa and Missouri, and I had never been in the lower Midwest. And because I have friends in those places who are very attached to their homes and who have described home to me, and when I drive through Iowa, and I've now taken 2 big road trips through Iowa. I'm fairly new in the Midwest still, and I've listened to Willa Cather books both times, and they're so much set in this landscape right as it's being settled and as people are becoming very attached to it. So I feel like I had a very strong sense of vicarious home, even though it's a totally unfamiliar landscape to me. It had all of these markers of home or homeness that other people had talked about. So much so, I mean, when I arrived, I went and visited a friend and the farm he'd grown up on, and he's talked so much about this farm, and so that I knew I was lost on my way in, but I knew when I got onto the street that it must be, just from the description of the feeling of the street and the way the trees in the street related, and it's almost like it had sucked the air out of my lungs because it was so, oh, this is this home experience, but it's someone else's home experience. And then after that, I actually went back to the landscape where I grew up in. So I spent a few weeks with my family and my husband's family who live on the east coast of Massachusetts. And I had a good experience there for testing these things out. So I just had this other experience, and I thought, well, how does this relate to actually being in a place, that's arguably the place that I grew up. It's the landscape that I lived from when I was a really little kid until, on and off until almost high school. And so it's the place where I learned to drive around and to navigate and to know what trees were. It's also where I studied ecology, so I know in a lot of detail what the trees are and what their relationships are. And that feels comfortable, but it's not a social world that I have connections to because I didn't, most of the people that I knew, my parents don't live where I grew up, so I don't know people there. So it's this very weird feeling of, it's almost like the Ansel Adams or Sierra Club calendar version of home. It's like the photographs and the images, when I drive around, it feels totally comfortable. And I know that if I walk back 30 yards from the road over this dune, that it will look like this. And it's always kind of interesting to me to see what's there and to see, are there still this kind of shellfish here? And, what are people doing with this? And how are people making their livelihoods? But because I have no particular role in that environment, and I think this actually probably drives a lot of my interest in it, because the environment has been so preserved in some ways as a landscape for consumption and for tourists and people to come and take photos of. It doesn't feel like there's a place to interact with that environment. And so then I actually went down and spent a week on Long Island, which has almost exactly the same ecology, and which, interestingly, a lot more agriculture has been preserved, and I'm very curious about the political economy of how this has been achieved. But it was this fascinating hybrid of the ecology of home, so it felt very homey, but then there were all these things that were much like being right outside the Twin Cities. So there were, the corn was coming in, and there were all sorts of vegetable farms, and, it's obviously a somewhat rarefied version of this, but it actually had so many more interactive potentials, places where you could see young people actually staying in an environment and making a living there and feeding the needs of the rest of that landscape, that it seemed like maybe my trajectory as an academic has changed what I require in a home, to have some more of those places where you could say, all right, there's actually a viable economy. This is not just a place for people to come and consume, or consume visually or ideologically. So I feel like maybe part of what drove a lot of my questions were this persistent feeling that megalopolitan corridor between Boston and Washington has become very much a landscape that people, it's bedroom towns, it's places that people come when they're affluent enough to be able to afford to live there. But you have to make your money somewhere else, largely sort of in some financialized sector, to be able to actually live there. And I feel like here in the upper Midwest, there's so much attention being given to how do you make landscapes that people can live in and that support a much broader range of things that make the things we need. And I think that those things are actually being revived in the Northeast. There's just much more of a sense of a generational gap where they went away, people who were farmers or who made their livelihood through forestry or fishing a little bit less, but were forced out. And here it seems a little bit more continuous. You know, people have been able to do those things and to continue making those landscapes so they're not being created again out of imagination. I mean, and both of those things have interest. So one of my very old acquaintances is farming in Maine, and as someone, you know, not as far as I know, no real history of farming, no family associations with farming, and is farming a piece of land where he has to raise pigs to clear the forest again. I mean, and I remember this being a really earth-shattering revelation. It sounds strangely sentimental in some ways, but at some point it occurred to me that people were clearing a forest that had been incredibly painstakingly cleared. And I had a colleague who was an archaeologist in Ontario who've tracked the family histories of families who had come as indentured servants from Germany. They'd come, and one of the ways that you could pay off your ship passage was to clear roads. And they had cleared roads to Ontario through Pennsylvania, and the life expectancy of these people was less than 30, and it was such hard work, and they were clearing roads, and then in order to homestead a farm, you had to actually clear that and maintain that landscape. And you know, and these people were really dying by 30 because they were just such hard labor and such hard lives and such, you know, uncertain nutrition, and the idea that landscape and all of that work that had been clearing this landscape and making it into something, you know, that's happened again and again. So, you know, arguably there was some of that clearing in the indigenous landscape, and then, you know, everyone who lived here prior to European settlement has cleared it to make it a usable landscape for them. That all of that labor and effort had been erased because some people would like to believe that they had no effect on the environment, that they had allowed these trees to grow up around them to feel more environmentally sanctified. That just struck me as so cheating and so like an easy way out of environmental dilemmas. It's almost like it's this sleight of hand that seems like it simplifies everything and makes it much harder to actually address any of the problems that people feel guilty about and hence let trees grow around them.
I want to go back to something you said about Iowa and your travels through Iowa, which was the Willa Cather as you went through. And that, I mean, I think of Willa Cather, I think of Grant Wood, I think of Sinclair Lewis, I think of all these people who are the right people to have around one as one drives through certain places, right, because they provide the background. I mean, what you're studying is partly the way people read landscapes or make meaning out of landscapes, or perhaps mistake or miss things about landscapes that it would be helpful for them to know in terms of their thinking about how to intervene next,
right,
so to speak. I'm wondering how you think about this role for the literary and visual arts in providing the context.
I think it's a huge role. I mean, and this is one of the things, I think it's interesting. So in a cultural way, it's one of the things that makes the Twin Cities feel like such a good home place because there's such a role for these things. This is part of why I was telling you earlier about the photographer disc farmer, because I think the everyday landscape becomes so the backdrop for everything, setting. You know, when you look even at fiction, you know, people spend a lot of time thinking explicitly about character and thinking about plot. And I spend a lot of time thinking about setting and what happens in the setting is so hard for people to see because we're so inclined to look at the foreground and the people moving around in the landscape. And I think that through visual arts and literature and drama and, in many ways also through history and, and the humanities, we can come in almost through, I often think of it, it's like the moments where you catch your unconscious decisions from a side view, and you catch all of the influences and the things that are incredibly important in making decisions and in producing everyday life, but that have become so habitual that we can't see them anymore. And so they can be made, Grant Wood is a great example because proportions are shifted in just such a way that things become uncanny. And then when you look at it, it's all so ordinary, and yet it's compelling in a way that it wouldn't necessarily have been if you had seen the real image of what he's interpreting. So I think one of the things that's tricky with this is that we live in such a mediated informational world that people have become accustomed to having some level of interactivity with these things. And I feel like, without necessarily wanting to always pander to that, I think that there is no replacement for reading a Willa Cather novel. But I also think that especially for publicly engaged social scientists who are interested in art, there are these ways to make people more able to actually participate in these things. And I think for me, part of it is letting people see you make things like the food system. The food system is this level of analysis that has become very trendy to talk about. And to say, to use representations, I think I'm working on this very large project right now that's the 11 counties of southeast Minnesota trying to think about how to plan their food system. And, certain sectors are very interested in this and other sectors are not. And my personal sort of shorthand for this project is the I'll be your mirror project, because I feel like there's a way in which I don't actually need to produce anything for them. I need to just show them how, the beauty and compellingness of what has already been created, and then what needs more attention. So my metaphor for this is the Mill City Farmers Market, because here in the Twin Cities, I would say probably the farmers market that the most aesthetic attention goes into is the Mill Cities Farmers Market. It's one of the markets that has a lot of value-added products and flowers and things that people have made to be beautiful in addition to the things that people have made to be useful and edible. And it takes place right at the foot of the old Pillsbury grain elevators, right at the Mill City Museum. And I tend to think of it's this amazing, vibrant celebration of vegetable agriculture and the critiques of the food system that represent about 2% of what people eat. And there's almost no engagement at all with these amazing, gorgeous grain elevators that are behind them that represent processed food and the whole world of commodities and global trade and agriculture. And this, Minneapolis is the flower city, this incredibly evocative history of the river and manufacturing that represents 98% of what people eat. But I feel like what has happened is people writing books about farms and people, making art about vegetables have made the vegetable side of agriculture very approachable and a very storied and richly textured, approachable thing that people want to get involved in, and they make performances of meals part of their lives. And I think that the processed side has been made unapproachable both by people who would like it to be unapproachable because they have a lot of things that they're doing with it that they don't necessarily want everyone involved in, but also by people like Michael Pollan who have basically said that world is complicated and problematic, but it doesn't have a lot of entry points for us. And I feel like I'm fascinated right now at finding the artists and the literature of processing. I just went through the whole Weissman's rental art this morning I'm trying to disabuse people of the idea that only vegetables are beautiful. And there's only one manufacturing piece of art that's currently, and that might be because everyone has the manufacturing art out, but I suspect not. There's tons of images of vegetables, artichokes and asparagus and chickens and farms, and there's almost none of sort of the beauty of the industrial side and of flax seeds that get made into all these amazing things. And that seems like a very understandable failure of imagination, but one that could really be addressed, especially here in a place like the Flower City, where we've got all this, these old buildings that say the Flower City, whatever, and have these sort of gorgeous pieces and stories that go along with them that could have more interactive engagement facilitated around them, I think. I was very pleased to see when they did the Northern Spark, the Nuit Blanche, organized around the river this summer, the number of different things that incorporated grain elevators, and they were projecting images up on them and really drawing them in.
I remember when I took the tour of the Mill City Museum, the one fact that stood out was that all of these things are museums because of something like a change in the tax code that made electricity from Canada coming down to places like Buffalo, New York, suddenly competitive with rivers. And
right.
So it's like, and I mean the fields, when I grew up, there were sparrows. Bird meant sparrow and robin in the spring. Now, I go to see my mother, there are plenty of colorful birds, but there are hardly any sparrows. And the reason is, the wheat's all gone. The large economic forces that made wheat make sense for Minnesota then now make corn and soybeans monopoly crop.
Right.
And I don't know what that means in terms of meaning making, but it's like wheat divorced us. It was a bad divorce.
Right.
And they left a lot of their junk on our riverbank.
And it's an interesting, it's a really interesting question. Especially as someone not from this landscape. So when I go, wheat, for me, I'm working down in southeast Minnesota, and the record of wheat that I see in that landscape, it's almost like, to carry the divorce metaphor, it was sort of an abusive relationship. So wheat was like corn, a huge monoculture, and particularly in the early years, a boomer crop. So you can see especially as you get toward the driftless region where there's more topography in the land, you can see this profile on the hills where there's this little slump, and it was where the hills were plowed for wheat, and there wasn't enough soil structure. The angle of repose of the soil was too steep, really, or not enough to be plowed at least. So you got tremendous erosion down the hills, and often, especially through conservation titles and things, people are plowing flatter land. Although as corn becomes important and very lucrative, you can see that plowing creeping back up the hills again. And you can see one of the experiences I had that I so enjoyed last fall was driving around with Wayne Martin, who is extension faculty at the university, and he does a lot with small animal livestock, but he was driving me down to southeast Minnesota and would say, "Oh, look at that field, it's been tilled at the wrong time, and it's going to be left raw and bare, and it's going to erode." And for him, there are all of these different practices that are better and worse practices in this landscape. And it's interesting because there was a very compelling study, and I'm kind of looping back around to the difficulty of meaning making here. So Iowa does a farmer study every year, and last year's farmer study, so thousands of farmers, it's a very extensive study, basically said two things. One was if they had the choice, they would much prefer to have much more diversified farms. So most of them are growing mainly corn and soybeans. But the other thing they said was that without the Farm Bill, so without federal subsidies or the regulatory schemes that are currently understood to really promote corn, they would still mainly grow corn. And Wayne Martin had a nice explanation for that. He was saying, many people who are on the food studies side, who are interested in these things but don't necessarily understand the whole context, don't understand how much corn has been bred to be resilient and the thing that withstands drought and that withstands a lot of extra rain and across all different kinds of conditions is the most reliable way for a farmer to actually get a return on labor invested. And I think understanding some of those systems has eluded a lot of the public discourse around food stuff, and this is part of what I'm finding compelling at this point. So, I think I started into this thinking, how can we get people to be more interested in incorporating the kinds of land uses that support them and that they rely on into landscapes that they're more connected to. So, from my childhood, the obvious example was that paper lands in New England were being sold. So the landscape that was largely used to make toilet paper and low-quality paper products, there was a lot of concern over the use of that land. So people didn't like when pesticides were used, and people didn't like it when particular kinds of cutting regimes were enforced. And this is not a landscape of very large clear cuts. So one of the great examples, I remember somebody going around with a petition on a clipboard saying, we demand that clear cuts be only, less than 100 acres. And there were very few clear cuts of that scale. So they were using a campaign from the Pacific Northwest, basically with a really good intent to say, we would like to preserve the environment here, suggesting that something that was never done was done. So they're fighting against the wrong enemy. And what ended up happening, not just because of that, because of the larger global political economy, is that a lot of those producers sold that land, disinvested, and moved to places like Amazonia, where they're cutting the rainforest to make toilet paper. And you think, all right, it's a very complicated thing, but there is a responsibility there in people's everyday landscapes to not push all of the needs that they have onto other people. Now, as people seem to be getting really interested in food needs and how do we meet our own food needs, to not just have that be around the aesthetics of vegetables, like because we would like pretty agriculture around us, but to say, what are some of those systems, like the electricity taxes and the things that shift this, and this sort of very large, complicated global political economy, how does that affect my everyday life, and how can I make decisions that are responsible in relation to it without totally overtaxing my, willingness or ability to understand systems. My husband, who's a psychologist, always reminds me, there are calories that are required to understand any of these things. And every time you're asking somebody to engage in some really complicated system, you're competing against all of the decisions they already have to make. And so I feel like here is again where we come back to things like Willa Cather and to art and the things that make things compelling and beautiful and meaning-making, that will allow people to have these engagements, but won't just leave them as something aestheticized and nice and kind of like over there for weekend reading. I feel like the danger of using the aesthetic road in is A, that it's usually controlled by people who have really large advertising budgets, and B is that it has that quality, and I haven't entirely gotten my head around the Minnesota version of this. I feel like there's a somewhat different role for things that are considered decorative or extra, and I feel like this is where art is absolutely imperative and central, and it's not decoration, it's the thing that maybe will allow somebody a slightly broader understanding of a system that's really vital to understand, or they're not going to understand why, say, regulation is necessary.
Well, I'm hearing a kind of the sense of a tension between what has to be a terribly abstract process, that is understanding how the whole system fits together, which is understanding that activism in New England may kill rainforests in Brazil, and that easing up on activism in New England might be the best way to save rainforests in Brazil. That sort of perspective, or just don't force things to change, even if they're bad, unless you're clear that the changes won't be worse. And that's a very high level of distance.
Right.
That requires somebody saying, I hate this, but I'm going to let it happen because I figured out what the systemic effects are, and anything else would be too dangerous.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things, I mean, this is where so kind of a lot of my current research is around kind of what is it? What is systemic understanding? What are the components of understanding something more systemically? And particularly, I'm working with a group here at the university that thinks about the marriage between systemic understanding and what is often called communicative practice. So the politics by which people actually discuss these systemic understandings and make actions around them. Because I wouldn't necessarily say that it was easing off on activism in New England. It might be something more like evaluating activism in New England. So if I hate this, I mean, and so some of my colleagues tease me that really my purpose in life is to get people to talk about things. And I increasingly think that this is not inconsistent with the I'll be your mirror approach to research. I end up feeling like a research psychotherapist in some ways. I'm going in to communities who are having trouble and getting them to talk about their problems in well-facilitated ways, and often with a really explicit question is, well, why does this make you unhappy? What is it about a clear-cut, and often they were not clear cuts where people lived. It was a clear cut 500 miles away from where someone lived. What is it about that makes you unhappy? And, and by being able to get into the different values of what it is that different land uses deliver to people. So, maybe that really offends your sense of the ecological integrity of the landscape, the watershed that you rely on. And then you can say, okay, so what would make that better for you? If it was a particular kind of management, or if it was replanted in a particular way, or if you knew that the governance was transparent, and to be able to actually move things away from the soundbite symbols into more complex understandings. But the tension there is that I think something that academics are often kind of bad at acknowledging is that soundbite symbols play huge roles for people, that metaphors are very efficient ways of bundling meaning. But to maybe create bundles, I almost think of them as being like flowers that can be unbundled and then rebundled again more gracefully, so that it's not like something that once you've condensed the value of an intact forest ecosystem into clear cuts are bad, that you could open up again and say, okay, there are different kinds of forest ecosystems, and some actually clear cuts mimic the natural, succession, especially if these conditions are there, that you could open it up, or you could open it up a little bit, just enough to say, what do we need to change here? Similarly, with the food system, I feel like corn is bad can be incredibly alienating. We saw at the University of Minnesota that last year, a suggestion, that there would be kind of a face-off between corn agriculture and people who are critiquing corn agriculture caused a huge controversy over the documentary Troubled Waters, when in fact, really what the central core of that is there are some problems with corn agriculture, and all of these great farmers are doing these amazing things to try to mitigate those problems. And so it was, I thought, a really dangerous moment, because it took people who had unpacked that story and it tried to cut them off. And it seems like one of the values of art and scholarship in society is to create more spaces for people who have taken those tightly bundled problems and unpacked them and started to explore them more.
This whole way of talking, this way that talks about systemic understandings and different, levels of it or complexities of it, seems to be in tension with the other thing you talked about a bunch, which is just one's view of the landscape. I was remembering as you were talking, thinking about clear cutting. I'm driving through some areas in the Pacific Northwest and feeling disgust at the forests. And the disgust was, this is just like a cornfield. This is an abomination for a forest. Mm-hmm. And that was that was not an informed decision. There wasn't a lot of politics behind that. I just looked at it and said, this is a wrong forest. I know what forests are supposed to be like. There's gaps. There's different sizes of spaces. There are animals running around,
right,
in those spaces. There's underbrush. Nothing. I mean, this is like controlling something that that it feels wrong to control that way. Whereas if people come in and cut trees in a forest, it wouldn't bother me. But that's this sort of immediate perception thing. Or one looks at a landscape and one might have all kinds of, one of the things I learned as a boy who visited North Dakota many times growing up was it takes years to learn how to see North Dakota, because in most lights it doesn't show. You've got to get late afternoon light of a certain kind.
What time of year would
I
you
don't
say is
know.
the best
I
for
think
that?
fall's pretty interesting.
Okay, I haven't been to North Dakota yet, so
Yeah, fall's interesting.
I'll take that under advisement.
But it's light. High noon is not the time to see much of any place. But that's all perceptual, and I'm wondering how those two go together, especially what I want to know is how do they go together in your teaching? Because teaching is about producing a sensibility. You can't do it in a semester, but you can do it with people over time. And what are you trying to do to people?
So this is a great question, and something I had been telling you about earlier was the GeoWall. So in the Department of Geography at the university, we have this three-dimensional projection space where we can make three-dimensional photographs visible to people. And so they take photographs with a left eye camera and a right eye camera and then project it through projectors that project a left eye and a right eye onto a screen, and you wear glasses that allow you to encode this. And I think this is actually a really good metaphor in some ways for what I'm trying to do in the classroom, because the reason that I use this with my students is to allow them, I call it a crash course in landscape photography. I realized Wendy Cheng, one of my colleagues when I was actually studying photography, gave a presentation at a geography conference many years later that allowed me to understand many of my own influences, because our teachers were very influenced by the new topographics, which was this school of landscape photography that was very political in late 60s and early 70s, looking at human-made landscapes and manufactured landscapes as worthy of attention in addition to things like wilderness or beautiful landscapes. And part of what I'm trying to do for students is to fast forward them through what took me, a decade of study to say, where are you in the landscape and what are you seeing? And what are the kinds of different ways that you could get at what you're seeing and represent the meaning and what seems significant? So, a lot of what we then do is in the same way that I would take a writing assignment where we have many drafts and say, well, what are you trying to demonstrate with that photo? And often what people think they're trying to get at and what is actually meaningful for them takes several iterations of talking through or writing about or trying to explain. Because when you see, for example, that forest, and you think, this is an abomination. And I for myself, I'm thinking here, when I first went, a lot of my research has been in New Zealand. And when I look at the forests there, they have very large industrial forests that are monocultures. But when I first went, I had that reaction. But then I thought, wait, I have no idea. Maybe the forests grow like that here. And so there's that moment of, here's my reaction. What does that mean? How can I interrogate my own reaction to figure out what are the lenses that I bring to this? So I come from a mixed deciduous forest, and it would function like this. So then to know what are the questions as a scholar that I can ask, and how do I approach that to be able. So one of the most evocative forests for many years when I was in graduate school, my family and I was working in an artist studio down in New York and visiting my family in New England, and then traveling across upstate New York to Toronto where I was in school. And the New York landscape in the fall is this, especially up around the Adirondack Park, where land was taken away from farmers and made into a park to protect the watershed of New York City. And there are these squares that become evident in the landscape where different species of trees were planted and they turn at different rates. So it's this sudden moment where what looks like a natural mixed forest all of a sudden becomes a patchwork quilt, and you can see that it was planted. And I would stop and ask people, what's up with this? And no one would know. I never found anyone, and I eventually found scholars who told me the story of this, but that story had not become embedded enough for people to be able to interpret it or to necessarily see it and work with it. I mean, maybe if it was a piece of land they knew well, they would say, oh, that's so-and-so's woodlot and that's his larches turning. But to be able to, I think one of the most important pieces, especially of a liberal arts education, and I have a lot of liberal arts students, is to be able to come in and say, what am I seeing here? Why do I see that? What do I feel like I need to do about that? And then what are the decisions that I'm going to make about that? How much are those based on my own experience, and how much does the collective experience I have with the other people who will be responsible for these decisions, how does that actually relate? So I feel like we do a lot of introspective writing and then writing for different kinds of audiences. My students all write proposals to real people in the community, often about environmental interventions they'd like to make. And they have to say things like, how are we going to evaluate whether the interventions we're making have the kinds of effects we think? How are we going to deal with people who have different goals in the environment? How are we going to figure out what our motives are? And I think that learning to see what it is that you're seeing is a really valuable step to kind of reverse engineer some of those other things that are there, but often, like in all the decisions we make in the everyday landscape, like why do we have lawns? So I'm teaching a new class this year that will be about environmental decision making from lawns to climate change. So taking those really palpable things and those really unpalpable things and making all the pieces that go into those decisions with incredibly material effects a little bit less ephemeral, so that they can actually be grasped and decided about rather than just made automatically. And I have some great colleagues. Next time you go up to the Pacific Northwest, I'll have to try to hook you up with them, who are actually creating immersive visualization labs where they bring people in, particularly in British Columbia. John Salters is the person I know doing this, and I think he ran a whole pavilion when the Olympics were in Vancouver, letting people come in and see this, where they come in and see 3D representations of what the landscape will be like over time if they'd make different kinds of management decisions. And it has all sorts of fascinating ethics. You know, if you make something really, really very realistic looking, how do you represent uncertainty? This is what experts think, but do you need to make it grainier and more blurry if there's more uncertainty in this scenario? Because you can influence people so much by making the landscape look a particular way. And people don't necessarily have those tools to stop and say, wait, why am I seeing it like this? What's acting on me here? And I've tried everything to get at this. I spent a fair amount of time when I was still an undergraduate working in a really basic visual perception lab, trying to figure out, what are the filters that we get between what we see as visual input and then what we interpret as perception. But it turns out that we're still really at a basic level of understanding those things. But.
Well, I'm haunted as I'm talking to you by a phrase quoted from who knows whom by a guest some time ago, Andrew Light. And the phrase is tremendous trifles. And he's talking about his the early experience of going to a place and feeling at home in it in a certain way, and having a kind of mission. I mean, he's now working in environmental change at the highest levels, but that whole mission and a couple of PhDs came out of, in part, his thought about this little place he'd gone to. And, I mean, it's the trifles part of it that I wanted to ask about, because I think part of what I notice is that large spaces turn off my capacity to notice what I'm doing, and my capacity to engage emotionally in certain ways. Not always, but the spaces I remember are the spaces in the lilacs outside my elementary school, which was one of the last two-room elementary schools around in Forest City, Minnesota. So named because the squirrel that had come from tree to tree from the East Coast there saw the prairie and had a heart attack and died. The forest city had this little bit of lilacs with trails in it. And there were industrial things, gears and such in that. No piece of land has ever been more important to me than those lilacs. And it was partly because there were 4 trails through. It was manageable. And I don't know, I'm just wondering what you think about small-scale landscapes and training wheels for people's landscape perceptions and places where the heart begins to have feelings about nature. And in autobiographies, there are tons of these mentioned, the initial places. And if you go back to Willa Cather, it's not all of Willa Cather. It's that first scene with him teaching, Antonia, the kid teaching Antonia English in the, out in the prairie with the grass over them.
Right, well, and I just read O Pioneers, and it's the scene of coming back to a landscape where all different kinds of experiments have been tried, but at a small scale, and then have become larger, and it's the garden and the orchard. And I think that I really like this metaphor of training wheels for landscape, because I think, for me, one of my driving motives, and this whole idea of making spaces within residential landscapes for people to be able to interact with the landscape. I think that people are industrious and like to do things and like to make things, and that we make meaning well in our everyday tasks. Even if it becomes invisible to us, it's still often very meaningful. And I think that things like the schoolyard where you could go and you could do stuff, and you hatched plans in those lilacs, and you did stuff. It wasn't just an aesthetic space. So I think that parks in urban areas, for example, are very important, but I think that the ability to have some interactive spaces in those parks and not just have them be visual consumption landscapes is incredibly important. And one of the projects that I most enjoy working with here, there's a long-term land access group working to try to secure agricultural land within the cities, and to say that our whole system of the way that we value land is currently around, there's this idea of highest and best uses, and those that bring back the most tax revenue to cities, or so like high-end development is a really highest and best use under this system. And I really like this idea that we broaden our idea of the values that landscape delivers, and that we figure out how in our monetary and moral economies to give more credit to different kinds of value in the landscape. And one of those might be the training wheels. There are so many people who are dying to become more involved in the food system in some way. There was a front page story in the New York Times last week, center below the fold, that said, we appreciate that everyone is learning how to find their own food, but please stop eating the things in New York's parks, because, there's this immense interest, but the infrastructure that we have to actually support people's desire to go out and do stuff and glean and pick wild edibles and grow their own foods isn't matched by the infrastructure that's there. But especially in places like the urban form here, which is not that dense, which has a lot of space in between it, and which, despite some soil contamination, has a lot of fertile soil and a lot of potential for remediated soil. There's things that people can do, and it isn't all. There's this idea of, and I think this is very similar to the idea that if we let the trees grow around us and we have environments, then we'll feel better about the environment and we'll make the right choices. I think that that's a romanticization that gets extended into, like, if we get our hands in the soil. I think there are all sorts of ways to get people involved in these complex systems of, international commodities trading and the way the Farm Bill is created, that could be equally beautiful and compelling, and could be really interesting, and could be, people running community markets and understanding how produce is is grown and managed and sold and refrigerated. I just went to Second Harvest Heartland, and it's sort of an amazing system of food movement beyond just that soil. And I think that valorizing some of that, actually keeping it connected, building much more of a place for these small nuggets that are entry points to be richly connected into the larger ecosystems of everyday lives decisions. That seems like part of what the kind of scholarly endeavor that people like me teaching are already engaged in, and that giving this both to students and all these people who are suddenly interested in the food system is very possible, and is one of the things that makes working in a public university really rewarding. And we ran 1 year of food documentaries, which we were, and not just documentaries, also fiction films about food and agriculture, which we originally were just going to watch because our reading group had films that had come up along with readings, and we needed a good place to watch them. And when the Bell volunteered, we had sometimes hundreds of people who would come out, and every time we showed a film, we ended up having to kick people out after hours of discussing these things and using those as these entry points into very complex and systemic conversations about food and challenges in the food system and what people could do about them. So I think we actually might be beyond training wheels. I think what we almost have is sort of like a system of nice rides that we need, that things where people can try out different ways to interact with landscapes and different ways to interact with these decisions that need to be made without like the full-on commitment of owning a bike. They could have a day project or a year-long lease on one of these.
Yes. Well, you're in a funny position. Let me see if I get it right. I mean, you're teaching people some stuff in the classroom that really only will make good sense if the city cooperates after they leave the classroom.
I think that in many ways, what we're teaching them is, and a lot of what I work on is kind of, so you come up with some interests. This is one of the things that I require of students, is that they figure out what they're going to work on. So what are they interested in? And then what would they like to see? What kinds of interventions would they make? And rather than thinking about it that it only works if the city intervenes, I like to think about it that we're giving them the tools to figure out what are the change points that they actually could organize people around, and so that governance could be arranged to actually make these things happen. Because these are the people who are actually going to have to go out and make things like cities cooperate with these and make the decisions that actually change the conditions under which something like a farm bill for the United States is written. And that's, it is in some level an unrealistically ambitious, I think, program. But on the other hand, that if we can't teach that kind of citizenship, and particularly a critical citizenship that doesn't just say, this is one of the things that drives me crazy about the food movement right now, is this idea that our responsibility is to vote with our fork. And I would argue that it's not just to vote with our forks, it's to vote with our votes, and also to recognize the limitations of the political system the way it is, and to change that. That those are things that are within the purview of the kind of political engagement that the bright scholars that we're training should be thinking about. So to say, here is how I understand how the food system has some limitations in the way that it's been set up. I'm walking around carrying the book with me, Class Dynamics of Agrarian Change, to recognize the solidarity that a state like Minnesota has with the rest of the world, in which the vast majority of people are, in fact, still, especially the vast majority of hungry people, agrarian producers. Those are things that I think can be reframed in such a way that they cease to just be overwhelming, huge systems in which the details are swimmingly complicated, we have no idea how to fix them, and instead become, really large, complex problems for which here are a series of approaches that, we've tried out with our training wheels, and we can organize other people to work with us on.